Imagine you're holding a report card, but it's not yours.
Right.
It's a report card for an entire country, the United States.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So you look at the front page, and right there at the top, glowing in bold print, is an A+. It says, rank number 17 in the world for human development out of nearly 200 nations.
Wow, so top 20. That's a grade that screams success.
Exactly. Prosperity, an undeniably high standard of living. But then you flip the page.
And what's on the back?
There is a glaring, bright red arrow plunging straight down, and it points to a new rank, 76.
Wait, 76?
Yeah, a massive, staggering 59-spot freefall.
I mean, that's the kind of drop that forces a total double take.
Right. How can the same country, measured in the exact same year, be both a top-tier global leader and, simultaneously sitting way down in the 70s, trailing behind nations with a fraction of its wealth?
It's a profound contradiction.
Yeah.
And it really gets to the heart of how we measure success as a species, honestly.
Which is exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring a really fascinating 15-page academic presentation. It's titled Deep Dive into U.S. and Global Human Development Indicators from 1990 all the way to 2023.
It's a fantastic data set.
It really is. And our mission today is to explore what the researchers call the three faces of the American Human Development Index. Because, look, there's no denying the United States is an absolute economic powerhouse.
Oh, without a doubt.
But when we adjust our lens, when we look at the mechanics of how that immense development is actually distributed among its citizens.
Right, the distribution is key.
Yeah, and even more critically, the sheer planetary pressure required to sustain it. That's when that glowing A+ report card radically changes.
The underlying premise here is that the traditional metrics we've relied on for, the past half century, they're giving us an incomplete picture.
How so?
Well, they measure the raw output of an engine, they tell us how fast the machine is running, but they completely ignore whether that engine is generating so much internal friction that it's literally shaking itself apart. Or if it's burning through all its fuel so fast that it won't even be able to finish the race.
I love that analogy. And I want to pose a question to you listening right now. Have you ever looked around and wondered if our modern definition of progress is actually a trap?
It's a heavy question.
It is. Are we reaching a completely unsustainable tipping point in how we measure human success? Today, we're going to use this 33-year data set to deconstruct that exact question.
And that 33-year time frame is vital. Starting in 1990 allows us to look at the dawn of the modern, hyper-globalized economy.
The rise of the internet age.
Exactly. And we track those structural shifts all the way through to the post-pandemic reality of 2023. We're looking at 5 distinct indices here.
So moving from standard measurements of wealth and health all the way to inequality, gender dynamics, and finally ecological cost.
Right. It's a comprehensive look at the mathematical architecture of a society.
So let's start with the baseline, the Standard Human Development Index, or HDI.
The foundation.
Yeah. Before we get into the anomalies, we really need to understand how this grade is calculated in the first place. Why do we even use the HDI instead of just, looking at how much money a country makes?
That's a crucial piece of historical context.
Yeah.
For a long time, development economics was obsessed with just one number, gross domestic product, or GDP.
Right. Just the raw money.
Exactly. The assumption was that if a nation's economy was growing, the people must be doing well. But economists eventually realized that raw national income is a really flawed proxy for human well-being.
Give me an example of that.
Well, a country could be generating massive wealth by extracting oil, for instance. But if that wealth is hoarded by a ruling class, while the general population is uneducated and dying young...
You can't honestly call that a developed nation.
Precisely. So the HDI was created to force a broader perspective. It shifts the focus away from just the economy and onto people and their capabilities.
Okay, so what are the pillars of the HDI?
It rests on 3 core pillars. First, a long and healthy life, which is measured by life expectancy at birth.
Okay, health is one.
Second is access to knowledge. This looks at both the expected years of schooling for children just entering the system and the mean years of schooling that adults have actually completed.
Health and education. Got it.
And third, a decent standard of living, which is measured by gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
So you mathematically combine those 3 pillars, health, education, and wealth.
Right, and you get a composite score between 0 and 1.
And when you look at the global progress on this front, the data shows something resembling a miracle, honestly. Over the 33 years tracked in this presentation, the global average HDI made a massive leap.
It really did.
Back in 1990, the world sat at 0.60, but by 2023, that number climbed to roughly 0.756.
To put that into categories for the listener, a score of 0.6 is considered medium human development.
Okay.
Crossing that 0.75 threshold, that pushes the global average firmly into the high human development tier.
That transition represents billions of people. We're talking about entire regions of the globe escaping extreme poverty, gaining access to antibiotics, vaccines, building public school systems where none existed before.
It is arguably the greatest success story of the modern era.
It is. And the United States, keeping with that initial top 20 ranking, sits right near the absolute apex of this curve.
It's assuming.
The U.S. started very high back in 1990 at 0.878. But by 2023, it reached a dominant 0.938.
Which places it in the highest possible classification. Very high human development.
And when you isolate the economic pillar of that score, the numbers become almost difficult to comprehend. The data shows U.S. gross national income per capita exploding from about $43,000 in 1990 to over $73,000 in 2023.
$73,650 to be exact.
Now, I want to clarify something for the listener here, because the presentation notes that this $73,000 is adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Yes, that's a very important distinction.
It's a term economists throw around constantly, but it's vital to understand what it actually means for this data. PPP means we aren't just looking at exchange rates on a screen.
Right, because converting currencies doesn't tell you what a person can actually buy in their daily life.
Exactly. Purchasing power parity looks at a standard basket of goods, groceries, housing, basic services, and asks, how much does this actually cost in the local economy?
Because a dollar buys a very different amount of food in New York than it does in Mumbai or Nairobi.
So by adjusting for PPP, this data ensures we are looking at real, tangible economic dominance. It means the average American isn't just generating more abstract financial value, they have access to vastly more material purchasing power.
And that purchasing power is staggering. That $73,000 figure is roughly 3.6 times the global average.
3.6 times?
Yeah, the global average GDI per capita sits around $20,327.
So the U.S. economic machine isn't just growing, it's accelerating away from the rest of the world.
And the education metrics run completely parallel to that wealth generation. The data shows that expected years of schooling in the U.S. hit 15.9, 2 years in 2023.
Almost 16 years.
Right. That is essentially ensuring a population is educated from kindergarten all the way through a 4-year university degree.
Which is incredible. How does that compare globally?
It's almost 3 full years higher than the global average, which is about 13 years.
Ah.
Also, the mean years of schooling for women in the U.S. is actually higher than for men. 14.0 years for women compared to 13.2 for men.
So you have this highly educated, hyper-specialized population functioning within an incredibly wealthy economic environment.
Exactly.
If we look at this through the lens of a mechanical system, the HDI is the theoretical horsepower of the engine, and the U.S. engine is a marvel of modern engineering.
It's generating massive wealth and pushing millions through advanced education.
But, and here is where the data takes a very dark, very concerning turn. Because while the wealth and education pillars are holding strong, that first pillar, a long and healthy life, it shows a massive structural fracture.
Okay, let's unpack this. The car is beautiful, but what's actually going on under the hood?
If you look at the composite trend line for the US HDI, you see this steady, triumphant upward climb from 1990, year after year, decade after decade. But then, in 2020, there's a sudden, visible depression in the line.
The overall US HDI score literally drops from 0.9 up to 0.936, and then boom, down to 0.925.
Right.
And I know exactly what everyone listening is thinking. It was 2020, the pandemic hit, a novel virus swept the globe, hospitals were overwhelmed. Of course, the health metric took a hit. Every single country on Earth saw a dip in life expectancy during that.
It did.
Yeah.
The pandemic was a universal shock. Nobody is denying that. But what the data reveals about the United States is that the health metric didn't just take a temporary virus-induced dip.
Right, it was worse than that. The shock of the pandemic revealed an underlying structural fragility, one that predated the virus and persisted after the initial wave. The presentation highlights a highly specific data warning. By 2021, U.S. male life expectancy had regressed to just under 73.6 years.
73.62 years. I really want the listener to stop and process the gravity of that number.
It's alarming.
We are talking about the wealthiest nation on the planet, a country that spends more per capita on healthcare than any other nation by a massive margin.
And to understand why that number is so devastating, you have to look backward. A life expectancy of 73.6 years effectively wipes out 3 decades of medical progress.
Like decades!
Yes, it sends American male mortality levels back to where they were in the 1990s.
That is genuinely staggering. Think about the medical advancements made between 1990 and 2021.
Oh, they're monumental.
The revolutions in cardiology, the development of statins, targeted oncology treatments, laparoscopic surgery, literally mapping the human genome.
Billions upon billions of dollars poured into extending the human lifespan.
And yet, for a massive demographic of the population, it was mathematically erased. It's as if someone hit the rewind button on 30 years of science.
And this creates a profound paradox within the data. How can a society be generating 3.6 times the global average in wealth while simultaneously watching its life expectancy regress by 30 years?
It doesn't make any sense on the surface.
And to add another layer of complexity, the presentation notes that U.S. female life expectancy did not suffer the same catastrophic, prolonged regression. By 2023, U.S. female life expectancy was at a robust 81.8 years.
Wait, 81.8 for women and 73.6 for men. That opens up a gap of over 8 years between men and women in the same country.
Exactly. And an 8-year gap is highly unusual for a fully developed nation. In most high HDI countries, the gap is closer to 4 or 5 years.
So what is happening? If our economy is 3.6 times the global average, why is a huge demographic of the population literally losing years of life? Money clearly isn't buying longevity for everyone.
That is the exact limitation of traditional economic measurement. To answer your question, we have to look past the average. We have to look at the distribution.
The shadows cast by this immense prosperity.
Right, because the HDI, by its mathematical design, is an average. It takes the total wealth, the total schooling, and the overall lifespan, and it bundles them into one neat, smooth number.
And that is the fatal flaw of relying solely on an average. If I own a company and I'm generating record-breaking profits year over year, the average wealth of my company looks phenomenal.
On paper, you're doing great.
But if I'm generating those profits by overworking my employees to the point where they are getting chronically ill and dying younger, is my company actually experiencing development?
No. A high average gross national income just tells us there is a lot of money in the room. It tells us absolutely nothing about whose pockets that money is sitting in.
Right. If one person in the room has $1 billion and the other 99 people have nothing, the average still makes them all look like millionaires.
Which leads us directly into the second phase of American development. We flip the report card over, and we have to look at the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
This is where the researchers take a scalpel to that glowing 0.938 score.
The IHDI was introduced by the United Nations specifically to solve the paradox you just described. It acts as a mathematical penalty, essentially an inequality tax, on a country's HDI score.
So how does that penalty work?
The logic is simple. True human development isn't just about the presence of resources, it's about the distribution of those resources.
Okay.
If health, education, and income are distributed perfectly equally among every single citizen, there is no penalty. The HDI and the IHDI are the exact same number.
But as inequality increases, as the gap between the top and the bottom widens,
The IHDI score drops.
So if the HDI is the theoretical horsepower of the engine, the IHDI measures the friction inside that engine.
I like that.
Yes. It measures how much power is lost because the gears aren't aligning, because resources aren't flowing smoothly to where they are actually needed. It answers the question, what is the actual level of development the average person experiences on the ground once you account for the fact that wealth and access are hoarded?
And the data here provides a brutal reality check. When you factor in that internal friction, the U.S. 2023 HDI drops from that triumphant 0.938 down to roughly 0.832.
Wow. 0.832. In percentage terms, the presentation calculates that as an 11.3% value loss in overall human development due strictly to inequality.
Now, context is important here. We should note the data also shows that the global average loss due to inequality is nearly 22%, 21.96.
Okay, so strictly mathematically, the U.S. is doing better than the global average in terms of total equality.
Correct.
But I looked at comparison and I think, the U.S. shouldn't be competing with the global average.
Why not?
Because the global average includes developing nations that literally lack the physical infrastructure to distribute resources. Places where building a hospital or a paved road to a school is a massive logistical hurdle.
That's very true.
The U.S. has the infrastructure, the hospitals exist, the universities exist, the wealth definitely exists. Losing over 11% of your human development to systemic friction when you have $73,000 per person, that isn't a lack of resources, it's a structural choice.
That is a critical distinction. It's the difference between scarcity and misallocation. And the presentation doesn't just give us the overall penalty, it breaks down exactly where that misallocation is happening.
Oh, this is the part with the radar chart.
Yes. The researchers use a radar chart, which is vital because inequality isn't a monolith. A society can be highly equal in one dimension and deeply fractured in another.
Let's visualize this radar chart of pain for the listener. Here's where it gets really interesting. It measures the inequality coefficient across the three pillars: education, health, and income.
So you look at education first, and the inequality coefficient in the U.S. is incredibly low. It's only 2.66.
2.66. Which tells us that, by and large, access to basic and secondary education is relatively evenly distributed across the American population.
Right. Despite the very real debates we have about school funding and quality, the public school system ensures that almost every child gets into a classroom and stays there for a baseline number of years.
The fundamental architecture of mass education works.
Then you look at the health inequality coefficient, the difference in lifespans between different demographics and income brackets. That coefficient is 5.50.
So it's higher than education.
It is, which reflects those disturbing life expectancy regressions we just discussed. The gap between those who can afford premium healthcare and those who cannot is widening.
But then we look at the third dimension, income inequality.
And this is the glaring issue. The income inequality coefficient is a staggering 23.93.
Nearly 24, compared to 2.6 for education. When you plot that on a radar chart, it doesn't even look like a cohesive shape anymore. It looks like a triangle that has been violently stretched out in one single direction. It's completely warped.
What this tells us, mathematically and objectively, is that income concentration is the primary pain point, damaging the overall social welfare of the United States.
It's the core source of the friction.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, a society can have the best universities and research hospitals in the world. But if a vast segment of the population cannot access them due to wealth concentration, the actual human development of the nation is heavily compromised.
Think about this the next time you walk through a major American city. You can literally see this data manifested in physical reality.
Oh, absolutely.
You have these glittering, state-of-the-art luxury skyscrapers, literal monuments to that massive $73,000 per capita wealth. And they are built just blocks away from neighborhoods that are struggling with crumbling infrastructure, food deserts, and underfunded clinics.
It's striking when you see it in person.
The standard HDI measures the height of the skyscraper. The IHDI measures the distance between the penthouse and the street. That 11% loss isn't just a statistical artifact on a spreadsheet. It represents millions of people not reaching their potential because the structural ladder they are trying to climb has missing rungs.
And this kind of severe wealth concentration creates profound vulnerabilities within the system itself. When resources pool at the top, it means a large portion of the population at the bottom has very little economic buffer.
They're living paycheck to paycheck,
with no savings to absorb a crisis. So when a macro-level shock hits the system, whether that's a global pandemic, a spike in inflation, or a shift in industrial manufacturing, that bottom segment absorbs the impact completely.
And that creates a deadly feedback loop. If you have no economic buffer and you lose your job in a system where healthcare is tied to employment, a financial shock immediately becomes a physical health crisis.
Which loops us right back around to why we see those regressions in life expectancy. The dimensions are deeply intertwined.
You cannot separate the income inequality from the mortality rates.
Exactly. The friction in the economic gear inevitably grinds down the health gear. But income isn't the only way a society divides its resources, its power, and its opportunities.
Right. If we want to fully understand the structural gaps, the presentation argues we must look through a demographic lens. We have to look at the gender divide.
Which brings us to the third major analytical framework in the report.
This section shifts our focus to two very specific, highly revealing metrics: the Gender Development Index, or GDI, and the Gender Inequality Index, the GII.
And much like the overall HDI, the U.S. performance here presents a fascinating, almost jarring duality.
Let's start with the GDI, which measures baseline capabilities. Basically, the GDI takes the standard HDI health, education, income and calculates it separately for women and for men.
Then it compares those two scores as a ratio. A score of exactly 1.0 means perfect parity between men and women in those basic achievements.
And the data here is overwhelmingly positive. The U.S. performs incredibly well in the GDI, scoring 1.009 in 2023.
Which places the United States firmly in Group 1, the highest equality group globally.
It's a massive testament to decades of social and legal progress. If we look back at the starting line of this data set in 1990, the U.S. GDI was 0.96. Over the 33 years tracked in this report, women in the U.S. have made huge, undeniable strides.
As we noted when discussing education, the mean years of schooling for women in the U.S. has actually surpassed men by 2023, 14 years to 13.2.
Women are highly educated, and as we saw with the life expectancy data, they are living significantly longer, over 8 years longer.
So on the surface, the gender gap in basic human development is effectively closed. Women have the health, and they have the education.
But we have to flip the report card over again.
Right.
Because then the researchers introduced the GII, the Gender Inequality Index, and this index measures something fundamentally different. It doesn't just look at whether you have basic capabilities, it looks at empowerment.
It measures systemic power, reproductive health, and labor market dynamics.
It basically asks, okay, you have the education and the health, but does the structure of society actually allow you to translate those baseline achievements into equal representation and economic power?
And here, the U.S. ranking plummets. In the GII, the United States ranks 46th globally, with a score of 0.169.
46th in the world. For a country with the most dominant economy on the planet, that is a striking discrepancy.
It perfectly illustrates the concept of the invisible ceiling.
Mm.
Let's look at the specific data points the presentation uses to highlight this. Female representation in the national legislature, so in the U.S. case, Congress, sits at 29.2% for 2023.
Now, contextually, we should say that is a record high for the United States. And it is technically above the global average, which is roughly 26.5%.
But progress relative to the past doesn't equal structural parity in the present.
Exactly. 29.2% is still light years away from 50%. You have a population where women are literally more educated than men, living 8 years longer than men, yet holding less than a third of the national legislative power.
The GDI says the potential is there, but the GII proves that the mechanisms of power are still heavily bottlenecked.
But what is truly fascinating in this section of the data, and honestly perhaps the most provocative, counterintuitive finding in the entire 15-page presentation, is the analysis of the labor market.
Oh yes, the labor force participation rate.
This is where the demographic data collides with the economic data in a very unexpected way, the labor paradox. When I was reviewing the source materials, this absolutely stopped me in my tracks.
It's a hidden gem in the data.
The presentation highlights that the gender gap in labor force participation is shrinking. Back in 1990, the gap between working men and working women was 19.4%. By 2023, that gap has shrunk down to just 10.8%.
On paper, if you just read the headline, a shrinking gap sounds like a massive victory for gender equality. It sounds like the natural progression of women entering the workforce, climbing the corporate ladder, achieving parity.
But when you actually drill down into the math, the data reveals exactly why that gap is shrinking. And it's not the triumphant story you'd expect. The gap isn't shrinking because women are suddenly surging into the workforce in record numbers.
No. In fact, the data shows that the female labor force participation rate has remained relatively stable in recent years, hovering right around 57.3% in 2023.
So if women's participation is stable, the gap is shrinking primarily from the other direction.
Yes. The gap is shrinking because the male labor force participation rate has been steadily, relentlessly bleeding out. The dataset tracks it dropping from 76.4% in 1990 all the way down to 68.1% in 2023.
From 76 down to 68. That is an enormous structural shift. We are talking about millions of working-age men systematically exiting the labor market over 3 decades.
This raises an important question. Are we achieving numerical equality through mutual prosperity and equal opportunity? Or are we achieving equality through subtraction?
Because a gap closing because one side is collapsing is not a victory.
This is where the true value of a multidimensional analysis becomes apparent. We have to synthesize these isolated data points to see the larger mechanism at work. Let's connect the dots here.
Okay, let's do it.
Remember the health data we discussed in the first section, the sudden regression of male life expectancy to 1990s levels. Sociologists and epidemiologists often refer to this crisis as deaths of despair, a devastating rise in mortality driven by substance abuse, cardiovascular disease from chronic stress, and mental health crises.
And then you layer on the income inequality data from the second section, the massive concentration of wealth at the very top, which leaves a fragile, unstable foundation at the bottom with no economic safety net.
Exactly. When you connect the declining male life expectancy, the extreme income inequality, and this massive exodus of men from the labor force, a very clear, very concerning sociological mechanism emerges. Over the last 30 years, the exact time frame of this study, the global industrial landscape has violently shifted.
Traditional manufacturing, heavy industry, blue-collar sectors, they've been heavily automated or offshored.
And a significant portion of the male workforce, whose identities and livelihoods were tied to those specific industries, have not successfully transitioned into the new, hyper-specialized, knowledge-based economy.
They haven't just lost their jobs and started looking for new ones. They have dropped out of the labor pool entirely. They've stopped looking.
And as we discussed earlier, in the American system, healthcare and economic stability are deeply tied to employment. When you drop out of the labor force in a country with severe income concentration and a weak social safety net, you lose your structural anchor.
The loss of purpose, the loss of community, and the loss of access to medical care combine into a lethal feedback loop.
The financial crisis becomes a psychological crisis, which becomes a mortality crisis.
It is a vicious mathematical cycle. The standard HDI captures the overall wealth generated by the coastal tech booms and the financial sectors. It averages out the prosperity. But the gender inequality index and the underlying labor data reveal the shadow economy.
It exposes the millions of people who have been structurally left behind by that progress.
The engine is running faster than ever, but it is ejecting parts along the way.
It is the ultimate proof of why we cannot rely on a single metric. A high average masks deep internal fractures.
Okay, let's take a breath and summarize where we are so far. We've established that the glowing A-plus report card hides a massive 11.3% inequality tax. We've seen that political parity is stagnating despite huge educational gains for women. And we've uncovered a literal life expectancy crisis intertwined with millions of men vanishing from the workforce.
We've looked deeply at the internal economic and social fractures.
Right. But what happens when we zoom out even further? What happens when we look at the physical toll this hyper-productive economic machine takes on the literal planet we live on? Because that is the ultimate boundary condition, right?
It is the unavoidable constraint. You can debate economic policy and social distribution all day, but you cannot negotiate with physics and chemistry.
Which brings us to the climax of the presentation and the fourth major analytical framework, the ultimate price tag.
This is where the researchers introduced the PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
And this metric fundamentally asks a philosophical question. What good is human development if the process of achieving it destroys the habitat humans need to survive in the first place?
The PHDI actively penalizes countries for high carbon emissions and high material footprints. To truly understand the impact of the PHDI, you have to understand the flaw in traditional economic philosophy.
Which is what?
For centuries, economics has largely treated the environment as an externality. It viewed the Earth as two infinite things, an infinite pool of raw resources to draw from and an infinite waste dump to pump exhaust into.
The cost of polluting the air or stripping a forest just wasn't on the balance sheet.
Exactly. The PHDI changes the math. It brings the environment onto the balance sheet. It essentially issues an invoice from the Earth.
And when the Earth's invoice is applied to the United States, the results are absolutely devastating.
Let's look at the data highlights here. Remember that phenomenal, triumphant US HDI score of 0.938, the pinnacle of very high human development.
Hard to forget.
When planetary pressures are factored in, that score plummets to a PHDI of 0.686.
Let's contextualize the severity of that drop. A score of 0.686 doesn't just bump the U.S. down a few pegs. It drags the nation out of the very high human development category entirely.
It drops the U.S. down to a numerical level typically seen in developing nations that are still struggling to build basic infrastructure. But the rank change is what truly shocks the conscience. It's the red arrow on the back of the report card we talked about at the very beginning.
When the environment is factored in, the U.S. plummets from rank 17 in the world down to rank 76, a 59-position collapse.
It is one of the most dramatic ranking adjustments of any developed nation in the dataset.
Just a free fall.
And the presentation is very clear about exactly why the penalty is so severe. It comes down to two specific, massive metrics: carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita.
Let's break down the carbon first. The data shows U.S. carbon emissions per capita sitting at 14.45 tons.
14.45.
To understand that, we look at the global average, which is roughly 4.54 tons. That means the average American lifestyle is emitting over 3.2 times the carbon of the average human being on Earth.
And while carbon emissions get most of the media attention, the second metric, the material footprint, is arguably even more staggering.
What exactly is a material footprint?
The material footprint measures the total physical amount of raw materials extracted from the Earth to meet final consumption demands. We're talking about fossil fuels burned for energy, biomass harvested for food and textiles, metal ores mined for electronics and vehicles, and non-metallic minerals like sand and gravel extracted for concrete infrastructure.
The literal mass of the economy.
Exactly, the physical weight of our consumption. And the U.S. material footprint is calculated at a staggering 31.2 tons per person per year.
Over 31 tons. Let's try to visualize that because it's a number so large it just loses meaning.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
An average mid-sized car weighs about 2 tons. This means the lifestyle, the consumption habits, the sprawling infrastructure required to support the average American requires extracting the equivalent weight of roughly 15 cars from the Earth's crust per person every single year.
And it's vital to realize that most of this weight is completely invisible to the consumer. When you buy a smartphone, you hold a few ounces of metal and glass.
You don't see the tons of earth that were excavated and chemically processed to extract the trace amounts of rare earth metals inside it.
You don't see the massive agricultural runoff required to produce the food in the grocery store, or the sheer tonnage of concrete poured to maintain the highways you drive on. But the planet feels that weight.
And when you multiply that 31 tons by a population of over 330 million people, you really start to comprehend the sheer planetary gravity of the American economic model.
It's immense.
I was trying to think of an analogy for this, and it feels like looking at a brilliant, highly celebrated corporate CEO. Imagine a CEO who is generating record-breaking, astronomical profits for their company year after year.
The shareholders are thrilled. The standard HDI is sky high.
Right. But then an independent auditor comes in, that's the PhDI, and the auditor looks at the books and realizes that the CEO isn't actually creating new sustainable value. They are achieving those record profits by secretly stripping the copper wire out of the office walls, selling off the company's vital factory equipment to pawn shops, and dumping toxic waste in the employee parking lot to save on disposal fees.
So what does this all mean?
It means the profit isn't real, it's an illusion. It is wealth borrowed directly from the future, and eventually the building is going to collapse because its structural integrity has been liquidated.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. The development is real in the short term. I mean, people are living longer, healthier lives today than they were a century ago, but the mechanism generating that development is fundamentally insolvent in the long term. You cannot run a 31-ton deficit forever.
And the presentation illustrates this structural trap perfectly by breaking down a 4-quadrant matrix on slide 14.
This matrix is such a powerful visual tool. Let's map it out for the listener. How does the world look when you plot human development against ecological destruction?
Imagine a standard graph. The horizontal x-axis represents human development, how long people live, how educated they are, their standard of living. The further right you go, the higher the development.
The vertical y-axis represents planetary pressure, the carbon emitted and the materials consumed. The higher you go, the more damage is being done to the Earth.
So ideally, the goal of human civilization should be to land in the bottom right quadrant. High development, low pressure. You want people to be prosperous, but you want to achieve it without destroying the biosphere.
The golden quadrant. a high standard of living powered by clean energy and circular economies.
Right. But where does the data place the United States? The U.S. is trapped deep in the top right quadrant. High development, high pressure.
The mathematical deduction applied to the US HDI to get the PHDI is a massive 26.87%. Over a quarter of American human development is effectively mathematically negated by its environmental cost. They are achieving the high development, but they are paying an astronomical ecological price to do it.
And here is the truly fascinating part of the matrix. Where is the rest of the world?
The global average is currently in a state of massive transition. Much of the developing world is moving from the bottom left, low development, low pressure, towards the middle right. They are transitioning into high mid development.
And that transition is the terrifying part for American global leadership. As these emerging nations develop, they have a choice. If they follow the American blueprint, if they build sprawling, car-dependent infrastructure, burn massive amounts of coal, and adopt hyper-consumerist material footprints.
They'll end up in the top right quadrant with the US, and the biosphere simply collapses under the weight.
But if they manage to chart a different course, if they navigate directly into that bottom right quadrant by leapfrogging fossil fuels, building green grids from scratch, and achieving high development with low material footprints, they will mathematically surpass the United States on the true planetary adjusted scale.
This is the crux of the entire dataset. We have arrived at the crossroads of human flourishing. We have to synthesize the three faces of the U.S. index we've explored today.
Let's lay them out clearly. Face number one is the glowing standard HDI, a nation of incredible, unprecedented wealth, vast educational infrastructure, and historical medical advancements that, despite recent setbacks, still represents a pinnacle of human capability.
Face number two is the fractured IHDI, a society deeply scarred by income inequality, a system where wealth pools at the top, leaving a fragile base that absorbs every economic shock.
A society where political parity is bottlenecked, and where millions of working-class men are dropping out of the labor force and falling into a deadly cycle of despair and declining life expectancy.
And face number three is the planetary depleting PHDI, an economic engine that requires so much physical fuel and produces so much exhaust that it is actively destabilizing the very biosphere it exists within.
When you look at those three faces together, the conclusion is mathematically unavoidable. The achievements in education, economics, and gender equality over the last 30 years are historically monumental. We cannot and shouldn't discount the fact that living standards have risen dramatically.
However, relying on an economic model defined by extreme internal income inequality and extreme external resource consumption is simply a dead end.
The math literally doesn't work out. You cannot carry an inequality penalty of over 11% and an environmental penalty of nearly 27% and expect to stay at the top of the global leaderboard indefinitely.
If the U.S. wants to maintain its leadership position in human development for the next century, the only mathematical path forward is a profound structural transformation. It requires a rapid, comprehensive transition to low-carbon energy and a dramatic reduction in that 31-ton material footprint.
It requires addressing the severe income concentration that leaves the bottom quartile so vulnerable to the shocks that are inevitably coming.
Otherwise, emerging nations that develop cleanly will surpass the U.S. on the true scale. Nations that build the future on sustainable architecture, rather than trying to retrofit an exhausted industrial empire, will define the next era of progress.
The researchers close the presentation with a statement that I think perfectly encapsulates everything we've unpacked today. It's a simple defining principle for the 21st century. Development should not come at the cost of overdrawing the future.
Development should not come at the cost of overdrawing the future. It is such a stark reframing of how we view our place in the world.
It really is.
It forces us to realize that data isn't just a collection of abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. It is the architectural blueprint of our society. And right now, that blueprint shows a magnificent, glittering skyscraper built on a very fragile, very expensive foundation that is slowly sinking into the earth.
We've gone on quite a journey today. We started at the dizzying heights of a top 20 global ranking, looking at an economic machine generating over $73,000 per person.
Yeah, a lot of ground covered.
We waded through the valleys of severe income inequality and grappled with the tragic sociological reality of declining life expectancy and a shifting, unstable workforce. And finally, we hit the harsh, concrete reality check of a rank 76 finish when the Earth is finally handed the microphone and its invoice is factored into the equation.
It's a lot to process.
It is, which brings us back to you, the listener. We treat human development as a straight line moving upward on a chart. More money, more education, more years lived.
Right.
But if the apex of human development, the absolute pinnacle of our current economic model, inherently requires the destruction of the ecosystem that supports human life in the first place, is our definition of development fundamentally broken?
That's the real question.
Think about that report card we started with, the one with the A+ on the front and the red arrow plunging 59 spots on the back. If you were tasked with inventing a brand new metric for human success tomorrow, a metric that couldn't be gamed by hoarding wealth or burning the future, what is the very first thing you would measure?